Today, I'm chatting with Irene Morning, an innovative somatic pleasure coach, intimacy educator, polyamorous human, and author of the best-selling book, The Polyamory Paradox: Finding Your Confidence in Consensual Non-Monogamy. Through her coaching, workshops, writing, and in-person sex-positive events, she guides others in creating relationships that fulfill their unique needs and desires. Both her work and personal life revolve around the belief that centering our own pleasure is not only healing on an individual level, but also in service of interdependence and collective well-being. Mm, Thank you so much for joining me today, Irene. What a freaking bio. I'm so excited for this discussion.
Oh, thank you. It's so great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I kind of would love if you could start us at some of the basics of what do you mean when you say consensual non-monogamy? What is that kind
Yeah.
of universe like?
Yeah. So often out in the world, you'll hear it referred to as ethical non monogamy or consensual non monogamy. And that's kind of an umbrella term for any relationship whose structure doesn't fit the traditional monogamous, like two people exclusively romantically or sexually involved with each other. So that can also mean polyamory, that can mean swinging, that can mean open relationships, that can mean a whole slew of things. And the idea under the umbrella of ethical or consensual, kind of being the identifier there, is that everyone involved knows that that's the relationship dynamic, right? As opposed to non consensual or unethical non monogamy, where we're really just talking about cheating or infidelity. I will say, I want to put a disclaimer on there that I actually don't really love that we're using any modifier on non monogamy. It, it feels kind of ridiculous to me that we have to name that it's ethical or consensual, because we don't have to do that for monogamy. However, if we're going to choose one of those terms, I personally like to put consensual there because I think it also prompts a lot more reflection and discussion around what does it mean to be in consensual relationships? What does it mean for us to actually really center consent in how we operate in the world and the culture that we're building, even in the culture of our interpersonal relationships?
I appreciate that. And I think, yeah, so many relationships don't actually have great consent processes because they are following a monogamous kind of elevator or escalator, if you will, of just like this is how a relationship unfolds. And what I will say about the thing with that I've observed with polyamorous people is like, oh my God, they're amazing communicators and like are skilled at that because you kind of have to be because that's a key part of consent. And
Exactly.
that's needed when there's more complexity.
Exactly. It's like to juggle some of the logistical things that non-monogamy or polyamory prompt of you, you're kind of forced to get really good at communication and conflict and repair and negotiation and owning your desires and all of these things that are actually like really vital skills for relationships across the board. But the construct or the actual structure of non-monogamy just kind of like forces those issues a little bit differently.
Yeah, yeah, which, brings in your work as someone who really incorporates somatics and pleasure and nervous system and all of these things in addition to the, maybe I don't, someone could go to a polyamorous focused therapist, but you bring in the nervous system. So why is that needed? Why do you do this work?
So, like most people in healing professions, it for me kind of started with me, right? Most of us get into these sort of support roles for other people because we've had experiences ourselves that really prompt us to heal something deep within ourselves. And then we go, oh, there's a need for this beyond just my own personal experience. So for me, part of part of what that was, I've been doing healing work for, I don't know, the majority of my life. And right around the time that I was starting to realize that I was polyamorous, I was also graduating from a master's program in a body-based healing modality. And I, my kind of initial foray into non-monogamy so intensely triggered my own PTSD and my own attachment wounding and my own relational wounds and ruptures that it was actually debilitating for me. Like, it completely interfered with a phase of my life where I was trying to get a business up and running, and I was trying to I had just moved to a new city and was trying to establish a life there. Like, it floored me, the intensity of the PTSD that was coming up in my body. And I was really confused by it because I also really knew, okay, I'm discovering this vital part of myself. I am polyamorous. This is becoming really clear to me that this is actually my identity that I haven't unpacked yet. And it's scary to reckon with, like, oh, who I am is putting me in a position that's hurting me this intensely. And I was looking around to try to get support for that, you know, having just graduated from a program that was focused on body-based healing, and also really being a huge champion of therapy my entire life, was looking for some intersection of therapists and or body-based healers that could talk about non-monogamy through those frames. And I was really coming up short. Like really actually couldn't find anything. You know, I'm one of those people who likes to do a deep dive into whatever material is available to understand my experience better. And I was reading all the books and consuming all the things that I could find to try to, like, unpack non-monogamy and how to do it in a way that feels good. And was actually feeling more shame about my experience doing that, because most of the resources didn't take the body into consideration. There was a lot of, like, really beautiful theory around how to handle jealousy and how to manage challenging feelings that might come up if your partner's with someone else, or how you need to communicate about your own desires. But nothing was speaking to the fact that my sleep was disrupted, or that I couldn't really eat on a regular schedule, or that I was crying at all hours of the day, and that, like, my irritability was through the roof. All of these things that were, like, very clear PTSD markers. And by the way, when I talk about my own PTSD, I'm talking about complex PTSD and developmental trauma, not like event specific PTSD. So it really prompted me to look at, I have this education, I have this professional background. How do I apply what I know about the body and how trauma works, and what I think I need to be doing to regulate, to non-monogamy? And as I went deeper and deeper in that direction, you know, as so often happens, more and more people kind of came out of the woodwork saying, like, oh, this is what I need too. So it really kind of, as I put those pieces together for myself, it really shaped the work that I was doing and the work that I was offering. And, you know, that was years ago now. And the clients that I've been working with since are just, like, so wonderful and amazing, and really affirming to me that, yeah, we really need the body to be taken into account when we're approaching non-monogamy, and trying to make that intense, you know, it's a huge cultural transition to make.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing all of that. It's like there really are two bodies of work that you're bringing together that were just so separate. And it reminds me of kind of what I consider a lot of early psychology, and frankly, still some psychology, is like it's so theoretical. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like many perspectives come from certain bodies and certain privileges. and versus something that's rooted in what do we know that people who have experienced this need, like what do we know happens in their nervous systems? And for many people in general, dating is really intense in their nervous systems. And that's when you're playing within the lanes of traditional monogamy. And then when you play outside those lanes, there's so many layers of things that could be intense to your nervous system, whether activating, whether shutting down. And I really freaking applaud the heck out of you. And I'm curious. So, let's say someone is in this space of like, oh, okay, I do want to explore non-monogamy, but I don't want to blow my nervous system out of the water. Like, what would you tell people who are just starting off?
Yeah. So I I mean I'm chuckling a little bit only because I think the deeper into this work I get, the more specific I get about going slow, or like the more I encourage people to go even more slowly, which is maybe where I was going to say that's maybe where some of my approach differs a little bit from some of the approaches out there. But I actually tend to think that we're seeing that as a trend in people who, I don't know, coach or advise or counsel on non-monogamy. And when I say that, I mean, like really get creative in exploring what it might mean for you to express desire outside of just one partnership. So, for example, if you are in a partnership and you want to open it up, or you think you have curiosity about opening it up, that doesn't mean we're going to right away go to sleeping with lots of other people, right? That means that maybe you have this conversation with your partner where, like, you get curious about maybe we want to watch some porn together and see what it feels like to watch each other respond to other bodies. Right? Like that can actually be an exploration of non-monogamy that doesn't occur to most people, right? Or doesn't really fit the frame of what we think of as an open relationship or polyamory or whatever. And I actually really encourage people, it's important to me to differentiate between sexual fantasy and what we actually desire in our lives. Those are not always the same things, but giving ourselves space to explore fantasy can be a really useful tool in initial steps of how do I feel about my partner expressing desire for someone else, or how does it feel to my partner when I express desire for someone else, and just kind of trying on like a little tiny flavor of that dynamic. If you're not in a partnership and you think that might be a direction that you want to be going, I encourage you, if you're actively dating, to bring up that conversation on dates and say, like, this is something that I'm entertaining. I don't have conclusions about it, but like, how does that land with you? What do you think about non-monogamy? Having those conversations with people can be really illuminating for how you feel. Like, we don't have to have a curiosity. And I mean, it actually feels really important to me to separate out like having our desires from the need to immediately take big action on them, right? Like it's really useful to say, I have this curiosity or I have this desire. What is the smallest doable thing that can be a step towards exploring it, right? And that's some of where the nervous system stuff comes in for me. And being a trauma-informed practitioner is like, we're not ever looking to make big leaps because that's not how we integrate well, right? We're actually looking for what's the next doable step. And then let me get there and hang out there and feel what it feels like and see if that's where I want to be before I try to go to the next doable step.
I love that so much. And it's really the core truth of any type of change that we want. If we want it to be sustainable and we want it to actually like feel good and, you know, blossom, it's way better to take those doable steps than do a big leap. And I could totally see where you can jump off the deep end and it might be really fun, but it might be also very destabilizing and very, or for many people, which you've written about in your book, the polyamory paradox is clients who really had that destabilized, dysregulated nervous system, unable to sleep, unable to eat, and it really kind of becomes front and center. And I was literally just telling the class that I teach body language lab last night. We were talking about like, yeah, you kind of have to give yourself space to feel that and be able to move through it. And maybe it is just the growing pains of a new level, but maybe your body has like such richness to tell you about you want more of this or you don't want that. And so like what a great way to 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 really taste test without going off the deep end. I love that suggestion.
And as you're saying that, what's coming to mind for me is also kind of highlighting the relevance there just for dating in general, right? Is like we talk in non-monogamy about NRE or new relationship energy because new relationship energy can be really destabilizing, especially if you're already in other dynamics with people. It can have an impact on your other relationships if you're like really starry-eyed and focused on a new relationship and that energy is kind of taking over for you. It's easy for other partners to feel kind of left behind or not attended to the same way, like they don't have your attention, right? But I think that's actually a really useful analogy for if you're not non-monogamous and you're getting into NRE, the person that you might be abandoning a little bit or not paying attention to in the same way is yourself, right? And I think it's really important for all of us to be able to recognize NRE is great. I love it. I'm also a neurodivergent ADHDer, and like those dopamine rushes are like sweet, sweet medicine to my soul. I can't get enough. And at the same time, I want to hold some awareness around that and be measured in, am I still taking care of myself the way that I need to ground into me so that I can keep my discernment online about whether or not this person is a good fit or if I'm just getting like high on my own supply over here.
Yep, yep, amen. Yeah, I think I suspect our nervous systems have certain similarities, and yeah, new relationship energy, it's akin to going on a drug binge. Like you are
Truly.
just like that's what's happening in our brains and our bodies, and it can be so much fun. And having maybe at least one foot on the ground, slowing it down, can be so supportive. I know you know, I'm usually able to do it to some degree, but channeling that new relationship energy and sprinkling it everywhere else in my life is really supportive. And you can't do that if you're just like, going 0 to 180. Yeah.
Totally. Well, yeah. And I really appreciate that framing of it because it, it can really be harnessed as vitality that supports the other realms of our life, right?
Yep.
But just like any nourishment, we have to be able to digest it, right? We have to be able to take it in and use it for what it's good for, not totally binge on it in a way that takes over everything.
Yeah. Well, and it brings me back to the really simplified way to explain trauma, which is anything that's too much, too fast, too intense, or for too long. Or conversely, really not having some core needs met. And especially if it's kind of a sudden thing. And so there are ways in which simply the structure of polyamory could inherently have some of that if you don't go at these small doable steps and really like keeping in mind your nervous system.
Absolutely. And just like for people listening right now, like that comes with like no shame or blame if that's how you're doing it, because that's how I did it. Like that's exactly what happened to me, was this sense of like, okay, now that I am non-monogamous, now that I'm putting this into practice, that means that everything's on the table, right? That means that like every possible iteration of what might happen with my partner or myself with other people is quote unquote fair game, without understanding that there's actually really like a transition period or an acclimation period to take it step by step. And, there doesn't have to be. Maybe you're just truly in your core of cores polyamorous, and as soon as you tap into it, it works for you. But for most of us, there's some deconditioning we need to do around how we've internalized monogamy culture. And that has to happen again at a digestible pace, right? So and this is where I think some of the philosophy and the theory around non-monogamy or polyamory can sometimes feel like there's a tone of judgment around jealousy or challenging feelings coming up, or at least that's how I read a lot of it when I was like early on. And I definitely see now, as there have become kind of like more support roles around non-monogamy, and it's taken up more space in the online sphere and on social media, I do see some what feels to me a little bit like gatekeeping around, like, if you're not setting up your relationships according to like these structures, you're not actually fully doing it ethically. Meaning, like, I see a lot of kind of judgment around people having certain rules or agreements that feel restrictive to other people. And I'm not here for that, because I actually really think what matters in non-monogamy is each of us really being able to take ownership of where we're at in the current moment and the current context and work with that. Like, if we're going to talk about consensual, that is what makes something consensual, is to be able to say, I'm informed on these dynamics. I'm informed on what is doable and not doable for my system right now. And I'm going to work kind of at this growth edge with all of that information. Not, I think I need to fit into this complete relationship anarchy model where everything is on the table all the time and my nervous system is hijacked all the time. Like, that to me is not actually supportive of intimacy or personal well-being, or really even collective well-being, right? Then we wind up in this place where we can't fully show up in the collective, and we can't fully be of service in the ways that we are meant to.
Yeah. And what I hear you basically describing is like nervous system capacity. And most of us don't have the capacity to go from zero to relationship anarchy. And we build capacity by taking these steps and helping our nervous system orient to being like, this is safe, and making whatever modifications we need so that it is safe and so that it does feel good. And it's sort of like, also, when you were saying like most people just can't jump in, maybe if you've been like in the area of communication professionally your entire life, like, then you're gonna have the skills. But a lot of us have to develop the skills to be able to do this, both, yes, somatically, and the relational, the communication, how do we make conflict generative? How do we repair, like you were mentioning?
And that takes not just trial and error, but it takes meta communication in between trial and error, right? And by meta communication, I mean communication about communication, which, like, we have the research now that people who do meta communication well have greater satisfaction in their relationships. Meaning, if you can get skilled at talking about how you communicate, what you're getting out of your relationships will be more fulfilling for you. And so, like, I was just talking to a client the other day about, we're having this meta communication in their partnership about how to hit pause when we see trigger happening in a two-person dynamic. There was an example in between our last sessions of like that coming up and trying to put it into practice. And then we have to go back to the conversation and say what worked about that and what didn't work, so that next time it comes up, we get to put it into practice with a little bit more fine tuning, right? And it's the same thing with non-monogamy, of like, we might have an experience with us being with someone outside of our central dynamic, or our partner being with someone else outside of that central dynamic. And that then requires coming back together and saying what's working here and what's not. Right? And that doesn't have to mean like you have to break up with that person or you have to stop seeing that person, but it means like, how do we maintain our connection even if this feels like a rupture? Because for a lot of people making that transition from monogamy culture to non-monogamy, they might, on a theoretical level and on some body level, want their partner to be with other partners. And then when it comes up in real life, it can feel really different in the body. So we have to ask, like, what does the body need to be regulated around this, to integrate this differently, and to move around feeling like that's necessarily a rupture. Right? Like, how do we begin to actually reframe that for the body?
Right, right. Because the body's having this extreme stress response, like, our person is leaving us, or whatever version of that story that's being triggered, which is such a deep primal need. And so, of course, hurting. And I know that one of your sort of things you have an opinion on is that sometimes jealousy can be framed as the emotional thing you have to learn to work through. But maybe it's something a little different. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I think, understandably so, in the world of non-monogamy, there's a kind of a big focus on jealousy. And even if that's actually shifting in the world of non-monogamy, I think that's kind of the first question that comes up for people who are not practicing non-monogamy, but kind of like looking at it from the outside, right? Like, I can't tell you how many people have approached me of like, well, I can't do that. I'm just too jealous of a person. Sorry, I just was hearing noise from the other room. I'm going to pause for your editor. Yeah, so I can't tell you how many people have approached me like jealousy would be their hurdle to getting into non-monogamy, right? Saying either I'm too jealous of a person, or it would bring up too much jealousy for me, or I just don't know how to work with jealousy. and really most of the literature, most of the mainstream literature on non-monogamy, and when I say literature, I mean like self-help books, not necessarily research literature, talks a lot about jealousy, right? I think because it's such a big question for people looking at it from the outside in. And I think it's important, and I want to give it its place. And to me, jealousy is not a central emotion. It's not a core emotional experience unto itself. It usually is compounding other emotions, meaning fear or anger or abandonment. I mean, abandonment is another one that's kind of a compound, but my point is that jealousy really points us to, I'm afraid of losing something that I identify as mine. Right? I have an attachment to a thing, and when jealousy comes up, I'm afraid that that attachment is threatened. Versus, for example, envy, which is like, I see someone else doing something or having something that I want, and that points me in the direction of like, oh, I really want that thing. Right? And I like to start by just separating those two, because I think a lot of the times, I mean, for me, it was actually a huge thing to recognize that a lot of the feelings I was having that I was initially identifying as jealousy were actually envy, and pointing me to like, I'm watching my partner live his life in a way that I wish I could live my life. I wish I had kind of like built in this much freedom and sovereignty and really clear internal signaling of desires and boundaries. And I was envious of that. Right? And so it actually pointed me to here's something that I want for myself, and I have power to work on that. And a lot of the time when clients wind up talking to me about jealousy, my first question is, can we get more specific? Like, what are the thoughts and feelings coming up for you that you're identifying as jealousy? Is it that you're pissed that you're seeing them do something with someone else that you've also been asking for? Because then there's a relational need that we need to talk about, right? Like, it's fair for you to say, this is hitting a anger point for me, that I'm not being heard, I'm not being listened to, I'm not being tended to in the way that I deserve in this relationship, but I'm seeing you give that to someone else. Like, then we have to communicate about that. And that's not necessarily jealousy. That's like, we got to talk, right? And so to really just kind of like sum up here, I think it's very easy when we're in a new relationship structure, or we're trying out new relationship dynamics, where culturally, monogamy culture has told us when your partner's with someone else, you feel jealous, right? A lot of us have really deeply internalized that. And so it makes sense that when we have big feelings in that context, we initially label it as jealousy. I want to prompt people to ask more questions about that, right? Is it jealousy? Are you having other feelings? Jealousy might be in the mix, and what else is in the mix?
Yeah, I love that. It sounds like you're saying, okay, slow down and like get more curious emotionally and somatically about what's going on. And are there core relational needs that aren't being met? Or sometimes it's also that those are, but we're not digesting them. We're not being nourished by them, like you sort of talked about. And that it sounds like for you, this brought up, yeah, more general things that you want that actually your partner can't fully give you. Like it's telling you you want a life more liberated. And I'm sure you made many changes in structures and how you live your life. And so I think that brings me to, um, well, oh gosh. Okay, here I'm going to pose two prompts. One is we haven't talked about pleasure yet, and I'm really excited to dig into your framework. Um, and what was the other? You know what? Let's go down the pleasure rabbit hole.
Yeah, great. I love pleasure. The framework I use around pleasure. So I guess it's useful to say that I also have a background in sexual health counseling. Like, if you go to get an STI screening, I, for a long time, was the person like asking you questions about your sex life and then doing birth control counseling and then kind of being the medical liaison between you and whoever the provider was. And I say that, and have some other training in sex education. And part of what is so important to me in the work that I do is helping people expand their notion of what pleasure is, right? Like, I come from a sex educator background, I come from sexual health counseling, and pleasure is not just about sex, right? The same way that consent is not just about sex. These are really foundational concepts that, for me, if we build our lives around pleasure and consent culture, like, I mean, it sounds so corny, but like, we would save the world. It would just be such a better place, because so much of oppressive systems and how they operate are designed to disconnect us from our bodies and to disconnect us from what is pleasurable to us, so that we're easier to fit into our role within those oppressive systems, right? When we're actually connected to our pleasure and letting that be the guiding force in our lives in truly like a well-rounded way, and I'll talk about that in a second, we don't fall into oppressive dynamics the same way, right? And similarly, if we have been the recipient or the victim of certain forms of trauma, well, not certain forms, really all of them, using pleasure as a tool in our healing is one of the things that actually like regenerates our nervous system way more efficiently and with way more support overall. So for me,
Yeah.
there's a few layers here of why pleasure is so important to me. It's a political thing, it's a social thing, it's a personal healing thing. Like it hits on all the levels for me. And
Yeah, can I
yeah,
insert my, I'm sure you've read Uses of the Erotic by Audre Lorde.
one of my
There's
favorites.
of course it's one you have to like I would say it's at least an annual read. It's also only like 8 or 9 pages, so it's very doable. Um, my favorite part is when she really talks about the erotic as our life force and as truly our life force energy, and that when we know the fullness of that, which for many of us, especially living within these systems of power, sex and intimacy may be how we do experience that fullness. When we experience the fullness of our eroticism, we will not be okay with and like okay with this living in this effed up society. And like it's sort of like our standard raises and we say, no, that's not good enough. And it happens slowly, but like you're like, my life force is too important to participate in this, to accept this, to yeah. So I agree, it's absolutely like an essential part of, I think, us, like if like we're forever going to really dream and create a new world, pleasure has to be baked into the equation. And like you said, pleasure is not just sexual. And you know my word of 2023 was sensual, and I really meant that in a very like, I want to play with my senses, I want to experience life in a richly sensational way. And, there might have been some sub bullets there related to the sexual, but so I really love that, yeah, pleasure can be the the lube, if you will, to facilitate the process. Yeah, so tell us more.
Yeah, I mean, even as you're saying that, I'm thinking about like, a lot of the kind of basic foundational work that I'll do with clients is just getting into the senses before we're doing any kind of work that, well, really before we're doing any kind of work, but especially before we're doing any kind of work that might be activating, so that we're connecting, even if, you know, focusing on your breath is something that doesn't work for you, that if you're someone where that generates anxiety, cool, we don't have to go into like that realm necessarily. There's other ways to activate your sensory experience that will keep you more connected to what's happening internally, which keeps you more connected to your understanding of where do I have attraction, right? Where do I want to lean into something that is feeling good or desirable versus where am I feeling a boundary or a limit and or repulsion even in my body saying like, "Ooh, no, no thanks, not in that direction." Right? And I mean, I can't tell you how many people I get on calls with or I start doing work with where kind of our starting point is them saying like, I don't know how to listen to myself. I don't know, like I want a better sense of what I like and don't like. And it's as basic as that. Like it really is as basic as that. Our body is designed to give us signals of yes and no. And over the course of our lives, those signals get so confused and there's so much that goes into us not being clear about them. And for most people, that not being clear about them usually feeds into dynamics in life where all of a sudden you kind of wake up one day and you're like, wow, like something's really not working here, right? Because we haven't really been honoring what does work for us because we don't know how to hear it. So to answer your question about like the pleasure framework that I use, I kind of adapted a biopsychosocial model to be more about pleasure. So for me, I look at kind of 4 realms of pleasure, which I tend to think are kind of all encompassing of being human. So the first is body based. They're not actually in any particular order, but body based, because of what we're talking about with sensuality, is kind of like always the starting point for me. I also look at mental emotional. So how you're feeling in your thoughts and feelings. I look at spiritual or energetic, right? So if you identify with spirituality in any way, that realm. If you don't, usually, and this one is always kind of funny because I have a lot of clients who are like, I'm not spiritual or have some religious trauma, and so that's a really sensitive subject. But a lot of my clients who say, like, I don't really connect with this realm of pleasure, once we start doing an inventory, there's a lot of really like rich stuff there. They just haven't necessarily oriented to it in that way. And then the last one is relational. And when I say relational, that can mean interpersonal, that can mean with other people, but that can also be with animals, plants, nature, with yourself is always an important one that I like to mention. And so the way that I use these categories, and again, that's body-based, mental, emotional, spiritual, energetic, and relational. I don't use them. I try not to use them in a super prescriptive way, but rather if you're feeling out of sorts or like there's, a problem that we're trying to solve or something that we're trying to address, we'll kind of do an inventory of like, how are you feeling across these four realms? Is one of them not getting the nourishment that it needs right now? What happens to your landscape or your context if we spend some time focusing on accessing that realm of pleasure that is maybe a little bit more offline right now, and kind of use it to resource in a well-rounded way?
I love that. Yeah, it kind of gives you, I think of analogies in terms of like, dietary wise, we used to have the food plate and no, that's what we have now. Used to be the triangle. But basically it's a way of saying like, okay, here's my plate. What am I going to nourish myself on in relational? What am I going to nourish myself on in this area? And I imagine each category is diverse and personal as far as like how you can be nourished. I know for me, like part of the reason why I have this podcast is because I'm really nourished by having conversations like this. Really rich conversations where I'm learning, where I'm uncovering and helping someone, share their genius with the world. It's so nourishing. And that was a way in which I was sort of like, how do I incorporate pleasure into my business? So
Totally.
yeah, how could someone, because I bet they're already doing things like you mentioned. It's just like maybe they're not as intentional about it. How can someone do this like inventory of like, where can I add more pleasure? Where am I already doing pleasure?
Yeah. So there's a couple, when I talk about doing foundational work with clients, there's a couple, like, I don't know, exercises that come up with the majority of my clients. One is actually just doing it as an inventory, like take a sheet of paper, divide it into four, write each of those categories for each of the sections. And then just think to yourself, like, when I think about body-based pleasure, what comes to mind? And you just do a full list, like eating ice cream, dancing, feeling rain, smelling my favorite candle, like all the things in how you access pleasure through your body, go there. And then go to mental emotional, do the same thing. Like when I think about mental emotional pleasure, and this might be a little bit of a stretch, right? If pleasure for you has always meant sexual pleasure, right? It might feel a little bit like, well, I don't even know what mental and emotional pleasure means. So like, for example, if you really like reading a book, that's a form of mental and emotional pleasure. Or Jaclyn, what you just said about the way that you're nourished by doing this podcast, I imagine that's a form of mental emotional pleasure. Connecting with a partner or a pet could also provide mental and emotional pleasure, right? Having a long conversation with someone who you're really connected to, going on a walk, like all of these things. And what feels important for me to highlight there is that the categories don't have to be distinct. Like if you really love dancing, you might actually put dancing in all four of them. And that's great. That's beautiful. That's actually really wonderful, because if you're then going through a hard time like if you're in one of those kind of like life is throwing you some shit storms repeatedly and you can't catch your breath, I don't want you to be trying to get multiple different things in each category. I want for us to be able to identify what's one thing that hits on all four so that you can just focus on that one thing as you're resourcing right now. So, I recognize that that's somewhere where people can get a little bit hazy of like, well, where do I put this thing or how do I categorize? But it's not really about categorizing so much as it is about you recognizing that you have all these different forms and all these different ways of receiving that nourishment and that pleasure.
Yeah, it sounds like
One
it's
of,
Oh, it sounds like
no, go ahead.
it's a menu to look at. And it's actually a freaking great problem if it's hard to categorize, because that means you're going to be nourished in multiple ways. And
Totally.
it's funny because I think we all have maybe areas that are more habituated. Maybe that's just kind of how our brain works. That was how our family did pleasure, whatever. So for example, I definitely come from a family of kind of like brainiacs. Like we want to research the thing. Like we're very mental. Um, and so years ago, when I started working with a therapist that focused on pleasure, I remember I kind of had like I was like, oh, well, I should be doing like actual pleasure practices. I say with air quotes, more sexual ones. And she helped me get curious, and she was like, "Oh, you're reading a really good book that you don't even want to put down. Like that sounds like a deeply pleasurable experience." And I was like, "You're right. I am good at pleasure, and it's fair to want other kinds." Yeah.
And I mean, I want to just reflect back to you, and like I know, people are not going to get the video of this, but like as you were saying that, like your body language in talking about like I'm reading a book that I don't want to put down was like full of eroticism, right? Like the
Hmm.
way that you moved in describing that feeling is like absolutely about eroticism, right? Like
Yeah.
there's a life force that comes online there. And that's exactly what we're getting at is, I think it's fine. I have a lot of clients come to me with like, here's the problem that I want to address. And it often has something to do with like sex or romance, right? And often, spoiler alert for anyone who's interested in my coaching, most of what we come to after the first couple of months is actually just permission to be in the pleasure that they already have. And that like
Yeah.
once we break through that barrier, they are so much happier, and the thing that they were fixated on quote unquote fixing in the first place kind of usually happens organically or feels like not that big of a deal. But it is actually a muscle that we have to strengthen to allow ourselves to look at the pleasure that we already have,
Hmm.
because we're so conditioned to think I need more or different or whatever we've internalized around the capitalism of pleasure. Like we actually have to take stock of it differently and practice receiving it differently. So the
Yeah.
other thing that I often do with clients is there's two versions of this. One is at the beginning of the day, one is at the end of the day. I'm going to do the end of the day one because it's a little bit more straightforward, which is actually just before you get in bed as part of your evening routine to look back at your day and write down one thing, one moment, one experience of each of the four realms of pleasure
Mm. Hmm.
so that you can
Yeah.
actually build up that orienting to, oh, I already have pleasure in my life. I already access pleasure in my life. I'm not broken because it's already there.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's the exact same kind of like you're doing a gratitude list for pleasure, basically, and you're recalling and you're helping orient to it. And I imagine you also help folks like get into it more sensationally. So like, how do you somatically savor that? And which is
Exactly.
why, and it reminds me of also like it builds discernment in your body of what do I like and what do I not like, and what structures within polyamory maybe don't actually work for me. I love them conceptually, but it's just not right because now I have this noticing of what's working and what's not working, and what's facilitating pleasure, what's facilitating connection, and what's not.
Right. And I in understanding more deeply what facilitates connection and what doesn't, and what feels good and what doesn't, right? I experientially develop the understanding that my capacity really matters. And I might like something theoretically, but if I don't have the capacity for it, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Right? Like I can set it as a goal that I'm working towards if I like the theory of it, right? Like maybe I love the theory of relationship anarchy,
And can
but
you
when I
define
look
that for
at,
folks who aren't familiar?
yeah, so relationship anarchy in short, I mean, I really, with any non-monogamy term, I really encourage people to go like look it up and ask people who are actually practicing it, just because nobody seems to use these terms the same way. Like everybody has a personal definition of it. But that said, generally relationship anarchy is kind of approaching relationships and connection with absolutely no hierarchy, right? So the example that I sometimes hear used is that like your partner who you live with is just as important of a connection as the mailman that you pass on the street and just like wave and say hi to, right? It's kind of this horizontal way of approaching human connection and saying each of these contact points are just as important to me as the others. And I think it is a really beautiful philosophy. And for most of us, there are just real life restrictions and real life capacity things that interfere from operating that way. And for a lot of people I know, they can hear that philosophy and say, like, yeah, sure, that sounds beautiful. And also, like, not what I want. Like, I actually want a few relationships that are extra important to me. Or here are the people that I consider, you know, maybe my polyamory includes my extended friend group, but I'm not going to go to the extent of making it quite so non-hierarchical in literally every single human.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the capacity thing, right? I think even if we're not aiming for relationship anarchy, right? I say that because it's kind of one extreme of non-monogamy. Recognizing what we have capacity for in building new relationships is important, and recognizing what we have capacity to digest or integrate in existing relationships as we bring in new relationships is also really important, right? I might have a lot of capacity to start seeing someone new. And if I have other partnerships where there are agreements about how we care for each other and how we show up for each other, do those relationships have capacity at the same time for me to integrate new people or things of that nature? And sometimes that'll prompt reviewing the agreements, but being based in our own body and having an understanding of how vital our capacity is to navigating these things just becomes more and more and more important. And I think that's, you know, part of when I was saying earlier, like the deeper in I get, the more I encourage people to go slowly. I think it's really coming from that place of making sure you're connected to your body and connected to your sense of capacity.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and, oh my gosh, it sounds like it could be really hard if you're, let's say you're a couple and you're opening up the relationship and one person has big capacity and big desire, and the other person maybe shares that same desire but does not have the same capacity. Navigating that sounds like it could be really hard if you don't take into account the nervous system and you don't try to go slow. And I'm curious what else, like any thoughts or advice for folks who are in relationships where there's a differing actual capacity or differing desires, or how to go about that process.
You know, there's an analogy. There's two things that come to mind for me. Well, there's probably actually a lot more things that come to mind for me, but I have this like flashback to a workshop I was facilitating this summer, where this couple showed up in the workshop together, and This was something I was co-facilitating with a friend of mine that was essentially how to get into non-monogamy safely and slowly. And there was a couple there who was kind of talking about exactly that. Like, one partner was a lot more kind of like ready and gung-ho and like, let's pursue all these things. And the other partner was having a little bit more trepidation. And I guess for this example, it's relevant. I see this a lot. It is relevant for me to say that the partner who felt more ready and trying to dive in and kind of like push the needle forward was a cis man, and their partner was a cis woman. And there's something for me here about understanding responsive versus spontaneous desire, where, and I see this in monogamous relationship too, where a cis man is having a different relationship to sex than a cis woman partner. And it really, it behooves everyone to go at the pace of the slowest person. It just does. Right? Because, and I say that immediately aware that there are some like subsects of the non-monogamy world who are potentially yelling at me through whatever screen they're working from, because that can be interpreted as not sex positive in terms of like shaming someone else's speed or slowing someone else down. And that's not exactly what I mean, right? Like, I celebrate all paces of sexuality. I celebrate all expressions of sexuality. I think they're all great. However, when we're working on opening up an existing relationship, it doesn't do anything for us long term for one partner to go from 0 to 100 and have that kind of hijack the other partner's nervous system. And what I wound up saying to that couple was, you know, they had had a couple experiences that she had found really enjoyable. And what I wound up saying to them was like, okay, you who feel really ready to dive in and you're excited about this, take a back seat. Like, let her lead for a little while. Because without the pressure of your speed, she's going to be able to figure out a lot more about what feels good to her. And her desire leading the charge is going to be so much more enriching for both of you. And like, you're going to be, I'm guessing, like, I would put money on, if you back off, if you just take a back seat and say like, I'm not pushing this forward for a little while, I'm going to let you lead, so much more pleasure is going to come online for her, because she's not feeling hypervigilant about like, is this going to go too fast for me?
Yeah. And because what's happening now is her break is actually on. So she's not going to be able to enjoy a lot of the goodness that is happening, or all of it she's interpreting through this like, danger. Do I need to be ready for danger? Do I need to be ready for X, Y, and Z?
Exactly. And
Versus, yeah.
yeah, it's exactly it. So even things that she might otherwise find pleasurable, she's not, because that pressure is there,
Yep. Yep.
right? Because the brake is on. So like, let's take the foot off that brake, which means you get in the back seat of the car and then she can find the gas pedal. So yeah, there's that. I'm trying to remember the other thing. This, probably edit this part out.
Sounds
The
good.
God, what was the other thing I was going to say here? It felt really potent. Oh, so kind of, when I say it behooves all of us to move at the pace of the slowest person, there's also kind of an analogy for me, and I recognize that this might be a somewhat problematic analogy, but bear with me because there's also some usefulness to it, where, you know, I think about the disability justice movement as saying we want to live in a world where accessibility is the baseline, right? And we are visioning a world where accessibility is the baseline. And that's how we bring everyone along, right? And it's the same thing for me of like, we have to actually listen to everybody's needs in the dynamic for this to operate in a just way. And it is an option, right? Like this is where the consent piece comes in, is if we're really talking about building consensual relationships, there's an opt-in and an opt-out, right? But we have to be able to say, here I am as a human being, and here are my needs and my desires. Or I'm in a place where I'm having a little bit of lack of clarity, right? But still be able to own I'm having this lack of clarity, right? We can be clear about a lack of clarity.
Yeah. Yeah. It can be communicated
It can be
and
communicated, right?
understood.
And then a partner, multiple partners, have the opportunity to say, I can work with that right now, or I can't work with that right now.
Yep.
Right? And it's okay. One of the things I really want people to hear is that it's okay to say, I can't work with that right now. It's okay to separate over these things. That is okay. It's painful, but it's okay. It's painful, but it winds up being better for everyone because we're honoring what's true for each of us.
Yeah.
Where I see these things getting really muddied is when we try to say, okay, I'm going to work with this, even though we can't.
Yep.
Right? So if you're someone who is trying to go from 0 to 100 and you have partners in the mix saying, we're not meeting my needs as a relational unit or in this relational dynamic, and your fastness is overriding you being able to meet them, that's okay, but you have to take ownership of it. Right? Where it gets really shitty for people is where someone says, okay, I'm going to try to meet you in this, but then they keep going back to that like 60 miles an hour thing. Right? Those are a lot of the cycles that, like when I'm doing work with couples, we're working on interrupting, is like, actually, what do we need to resource differently here in order for us to keep the agreements that we're saying or make different ones, right? Sometimes we just need to make different agreements, and that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And it sounds like, all of that does come back to what do you know that you need based off of being in deep connection with your body and not just being in a dynamic that actually doesn't work for you on both, on any side of this street, because there's so many different experiences and configurations. But maybe that means changing the agreements. Maybe that means like, oh, do the dynamics that each of us need not actually align? Or sort of like, how many people can I date at once and actually give myself in a way that feels good and reciprocal for everyone?
Right. And some of, I'm saying some of it is maybe we need to change the agreements. Some of it is, I think the thing that I want to highlight in it is sometimes it's actually just getting creative, right? Sometimes it's saying, I'm feeling like this need isn't getting met or this want isn't getting met because I'm trying to get it met in a way that I was told to my whole life that's not actually
Yeah.
relevant to my context, right? Like I was just having a conversation with a client the other day talking about finances in relationship and flipping some of our expectations around shared finances or how we boundary finances, kind of flipping that around and going like, well, it sounds like that's not actually working for you. So maybe we get creative in, one of you makes more money, but you're trying to not have it feel like that person is footing the bill for everything. But maybe we get creative on, you are funding like a play budget, and then you both get to to agree upon like what that play budget gets spent on that's in the name of nourishing your relationship, or you're each putting in a different percentage of what that play budget is, right? And that takes us really far outside, or at least for this client, like far outside of the quote unquote normal structure of
Yeah.
finances in relationship.
Yeah.
You're like,
And
you
I think
don't,
that
yeah, go
I was going
ahead.
to say that can go for every area of how you relate to someone, as far as being like, how
Exactly.
do we want to relate? And I think, yeah, and in many ways, I feel like I've had a very not relationship anarchy, maybe relationship smorgasbord is the better word, or but being like with my closest friends, which often happens to be queer friendships, being like, how do we want to relate? Oh, do we have a ritual that we cook together every Monday? Like, do we have these things that are kind of pillars of our week and of our connection? And I really want to credit Mia Birdsong, who wrote How We Show Up, with talking about, yeah, like let's expand this model, which I think, polyamory is doing, or non-monogamy is doing, in a way that's very romantic slash sexual slash intimate, but it can just be a broader way of looking at relationships.
Absolutely. I mean, I have some close friends who identify as polyamorous, and a major part of that for them is how they structure their friendships. And also within that, how they allow for sexual or erotic energy within those friendships, which to me is a really revolutionary thing coming from what I internalized as a culture of like, well, all these friends are hooking up, but for some reason we're acting like that's not a normal part of friendship. Or like it, especially in, I think for a lot of women who otherwise identify as straight, having erotic tension in some of their women to women friendships and like not really knowing what to do with it. And I see a lot of my friends who identify as polyamorous and include their friendships in that. I see a lot more space for sexual connection in those friendships without it causing the same sort of like angst or turmoil around like, what does this mean? Or do I have to then turn it into a quote unquote full blown relationship? Or, you know, this different line of questioning.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like a there gets to be deep care and there gets to be connection how there wants to be connection, instead of like, and now we have flipped the switch and we are officially dating and thus all of these things happen.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
What we call the relationship escalator. Like, oh, we go from hooking up to being in a relationship to being exclusive to being married to having children and a house and like blah 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 blah. Like a lot of the conversations I wind up having here are going like, okay, well, did we accidentally step on the relationship escalator without knowing it? Do we want to step back off and maybe figure out like, what do you actually want this to look like right now? Like, what's true for you in this connection? Because you get to structure
Yeah.
it however you want.
It reminds me, I've had several friends who actually lived with their romantic partner for a while, and then they no longer live together, but they're still dating. And that's an example of like, oh, actually, like escalating to that step doesn't serve this relationship in our life, so let's not do it.
Totally.
It's like you can really configure that really to your heart's desire
I'm
if there's,
hearing that
within
example so
alignment.
much. Yeah, that specific example of like living together and then not, I feel like is coming up so much more. And I'm like thrilled about it because I feel like even like 5 years ago, if you were living with a partner and then decided you didn't want to, it almost inevitably meant like, oh my God, do we need to break up? Like that must be the end of the relationship if we have to de-escalate from living together. And it really doesn't. Like for a lot of people, they're just better in that partnership when they maintain separate space.
Yeah, it reminds me of Esther Perel's body of work, which is, can really center that we need this separateness, we need this distance for there to be desire, for there to be erotic energy. And yet often we're desiring to do in the early stages of love is merge and blend and become one. And yet finding a balance to that distance is actually really healthy and kind of can fuel some fire.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I
Yeah.
even know, I mean, to a lesser degree, or a less dramatic expression of that, as I know a lot of non-monogamous people who do live together but also keep separate like bedrooms, right? So there's not this implicit assumption that we're living together, we're sleeping in the same bed every night. We might want to create separate spaces in the same living structure just to help
Yeah.
with that.
I want that because I'm such a light sleeper and sleep is so important to me that I'm like, why don't you go over there and I'm gonna get a full 8 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for a long time like that would be met with confusion by,
Yeah.
I mean it still is. Even I think of, friend groups I have that are not non-monogamous, and some of what feels very normalized in non-monogamy, still sometimes I'll mention it in these other spaces and friends are kind of like, wait, what? That seems not okay. I'm like, what do you mean? It makes everything better.
Yeah. It's funny. I'm going to make a silly connection, but I see it is how lawns are very outdated and they're actually quite an imperialistic, they have a certain history with the British Empire and how it really doesn't match what works for the local ecosystem, what's most um, essentially generative and what supports wildlife and pollination and just like we should just have like forests basically. And so this is kind of like, oh, instead of mowing our lawn, instead of doing it this way that we've always done it, that actually takes water, takes resources, it just doesn't actually work. We can do it in the way that allows for our gardens to thrive based off this climate, based off of what is easy, what is sustainable, what is pleasurable.
Right, the path of least resistance.
That's what I'm about.
Totally.
Yeah. Well, we covered a lot of ground. Are there any other things that you want to discuss that feel really connected to some of the places we went today? Are, for someone who's maybe early in exploring polyamory, what they might want to hear or know?
I mean, I think one thing that I think is always important for people who are in the early stages of it is like, please be gentle with yourself. And I'd like to remind people, especially if you're wading into these waters with a partner, you're going to make mistakes and you're going to have instances of what feels like rupture, and setting expectations that those things will happen so that you can focus your efforts on how do we repair well, how do we come back together well, what makes us feel connected. Like that's going to feel a lot better and ultimately more supportive to the process than beating yourself up for having made a mistake in the first place. So like
Mm,
even centering pleasure in that process.
yeah. I love that. Thank you. Yeah. And anytime we're doing anything new, we got to be gentle with ourselves. Yeah. Yeah. And I will say, I just had Hazel Grace Yates come on, who I know you guys are
Oh, I love
colleagues.
Hazel Grace.
Yeah, and so they walked us through the repair framework, and so that's these two episodes together are a really good duo.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't want to say, well, I'm going to say it. Probably don't get into non-monogamy if you're not interested in really up-leveling your relationship skills. It's it yeah. In short
Yeah,
that. Like
absolutely.
it will go 1,000 times better for you if you invest some of the energy into really working on communication and conflict resolution and how you take care of yourself in relationship. And pleasure can be
Yeah,
centered in all of those things, right? Even in what Hazel Grace teaches in that repair structure, like
yeah.
there's space for your pleasure in every aspect of how you do this, and it's an important resource really in navigating more challenging stuff.
Thank you. Yeah. That's it's an essential skill, and you don't have to be perfect, but gotta work on it. Hmm. Well, I love to give folks a taste of my guests, especially when they're such embodied wizards like you. So, is there a practice? Actually, sorry, before I jump to that, how can people stay in touch from you? How can they, with you? How can they learn from you? Which I will already plug your book, The Polyamory Paradox, but I'll let you plug away.
Yeah, thank you. My website is irenemorning.com. You can get in touch with me there. You can download the book for free there by signing up for my mailing list. If you, like me, prefer to hold a physical book, you can get the Polyamory Paradox on Amazon. And I am on Instagram as Irene_morning.
Awesome. And I will say, like, even if you're not interested in non-monogamy, I actually think this book has such core relational skills and somatic skills, and those two things together that there's a lot to learn from. And, you know, basically all these tools are going to support any relationship. It just happens that they're, essentially required and needed and when you add more complexity to relationships.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I sometimes talk about the book as like it's actually just a relationship book. It's a trauma informed relationship book. It just so happens that the examples I'm using are non monogamous ones because that's my lens for this. But it is actually like the core chapters are about conflict and about communication and about like how do we collaborate on relationship really.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, now I would love to hear what practice you might have for us today.
Yeah, I mean, I think, with all the conversation about sensuality, I would love to actually just guide us in a five senses scan. Um, how long do we have for this? Like, how long do you like the
Um,
practice section to be?
I'd say like a 10-minute one is a sweet spot. It can be shorter though.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Um, yeah, so I'd love to guide just a five senses scan, and then if there's time once we get into that, to do a little bit of visioning through the four realms of pleasure.
Oh
Um,
yeah, I want that.
yeah, I will say that usually the visioning practice I do for the four realms of pleasure is like close to 25 minutes on its own. So this is will be a very truncated version, but just to kind of like give you a taste.
Sounds good.
Great. So wherever you are, I want to invite you to just take a couple moments to invite your body perhaps towards stillness. And maybe that means finding some fidgets or some micro movements to let any active energy come to completion. Just take a moment to notice where you're landing in space. Maybe noticing where your limbs are in relation to each other. Maybe noticing the expansion and contraction of your breath moving through your body. Noticing if it feels more inviting to you right now to have your eyes open or your eyes closed. And if it feels inviting to you to focus on the breath for a couple cycles, you might invite the exhale to become a little bit longer than the inhale. And then inviting your awareness to the experience of sound. Just noticing what sounds are active in your landscape. And noticing how the vibration of sound lands on your body. Noticing what it feels like to listen for sound far away. Noticing what it feels like to listen for sounds as close as your own body. Take a moment to notice any pleasure available to you through sound. Maybe invite it even deeper in with a full breath. And then inviting awareness. Whether eyes are open or closed doesn't matter. Inviting awareness to the experience of sight. Noticing what it feels like to engage color, texture, light quality. Noticing shapes. Noticing if there's any pleasure available to you through sight right now. Maybe inviting that pleasure even deeper in with a full breath. And then inviting awareness to the experience of smell. Noticing any scents wafting in and out through the nostrils. If you have something nearby that stimulates your sense of smell, you might hold it up to your face and take a big breath. Again, noticing any pleasure available through the sense of smell in this moment. Maybe inviting that even deeper in with a full breath. Inviting your awareness to the experience of taste. If you have something yummy nearby, you might put a little morsel on your tongue. Noticing any flavor along the tongue, the roof of the mouth, the back of the throat, maybe even the lips. Noticing if there's any pleasure available to you through taste in this moment. Really savoring it. Maybe inviting it even deeper in with a full breath. And inviting awareness to the experience of touch. And noticing what it feels like for skin to make contact with air. Noticing what it feels like for the body to land into any furniture, clothing, even gravity. Noticing if there's anywhere on your body asking for more touch, asking for your own two hands, maybe asking for a different point of contact. And allow yourself to follow that impulse. Noticing any pleasure available to you through touch in this moment. Maybe inviting that pleasure even deeper in with a full breath. And then inviting awareness to all five senses at once, your fully embodied self, noticing any and all pleasure available to you through the senses in this moment. And from this embodied place, inviting the mind to wander, to vision, your pleasure-based existence. Living your most pleasure-guided life. What would that feel like in the body? What would body-based pleasure mean in your pleasure-based life? Feeling any aliveness that comes with that prompt. Noticing any sensations, any visuals. And then allowing the mind to wander to mental emotional pleasure. What would mental and emotional pleasure look like, feel like in your most pleasure-based life? Noticing any sensations, any visuals. And inviting the mind to wander to the spiritual or energetic realm. What would energetic pleasure mean for you? What would it look like for you in your most pleasure-based life? Noticing any sensations, any visuals that come up. And then inviting awareness, inviting the mind to wander to relational pleasure. What would relational pleasure feel like, look like in your most pleasure-based life? Again, noticing any sensations, any visuals. And then zooming out to visualize yourself in that pleasure-based life, weaving together all the realms of pleasure, all the sensory experience. Just taking a moment to let the body imprint that vision of what's possible. Letting yourself relish in whatever sensations are alive right now. As you remind yourself that pleasure can be the guide. And when you feel ready to close this practice, maybe taking a final breath and coming back up to the surface.
Thank you for that practice.
Yeah, you're so welcome.
Yeah, I actually had a lot of mine were centered around this new home that I am likely to move into. Gonna check it out again tomorrow. Was feeling a lot of yeses, but some nos. And so to be able to imagine and feel those different things there, I was like, oh, yeah, I think that's the place.
Oh,
Yeah.
yay!
Yeah.
Pleasure clarity!
Pleasure clarity. Yes. Well, and to tie it back, it's like we can't know what we're for if we don't know what our pleasure is, if we don't know what it feels like. It helps us in the moment say, ooh, that's not this, or oh, yes, this. Or let me move towards that.
Yeah. Yeah, like we don't have to have absolute clarity, but just the inkling of like, let me move a little bit towards this or a little bit away from this can be so, so, so illuminating.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for such a rich conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was lovely.